She thought humans were weak, until he ripped the door off her spaceship. Aurora, an elite Silosian noble, views humanity as a fragile, short-lived species suited only for clerical work. Her perspective shatters when Hayes, a human engineer she once dismissed, rescues her from a sabotaged cruiser by physically tearing through the ship's hull. As they flee across a hostile moon, Aurora discovers that human adrenaline and physical intimacy grant them a berserker edge that outclasses alien technology. Their survival depends on a deep, carnal bond that fuels Hayes's protective instincts, proving that human passion is the most volatile force in the galaxy. The metallic scream of the door gave way to the hiss of emergency oxygen scrubbers, but Aurora could only focus on the man standing in the wreckage. Hayes didn't look like a savior. He looked like a predator that had just broken into its own cage. His skin was flushed a deep, angry red, sweat matting the dark hair on his forearms as he tossed the 300-pound slab of metal aside like it was scrap parchment. He moved toward her, his boots heavy and deliberate on the vibrating floor, his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made her internal organs quiver. "Are you hurt?" Hayes asked, his voice a low rumble that felt like a physical touch against her skin. Aurora tried to find her voice, her throat dry as she looked at the raw power radiating from him. She was a daughter of the high stars, taught that humans were soft, limited by their lack of natural armor or telepathic reach. Yet, as he reached out, his large hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the violence of his entry, she felt a surge of heat that had nothing to do with the ship's failing heaters. "The seal broke," she whispered, her hands shaking as she reached up to touch the damp fabric of his suit. Hayes didn't answer with words, instead pulling her flush against his chest, the heat of his body seeping through her silk robes. He swung her up into his arms, his muscles bunching with an ease that suggested her weight was inconsequential. He turned back toward the breach he had made, where a pressurized boarding tube now hummed with life. "Hold on to me," he commanded, the authority in his tone triggering a submissive thrill she hadn't known she possessed. They moved through the umbilical cord of the rescue ship, the vibrations of the dying cruiser fatting behind them. Hayes didn't put her down even once they cleared the airlock of his scout ship, the Avery. He carried her straight to the small, cramped command deck, setting her into the pilot's seat with lingering hands. His fingers brushed against the sensitive scales at the base of her neck, sending a jolt of electricity through her nervous system. "You shouldn't be able to do that," Aurora said, her eyes wide as she watched him work the controls. "Do what?" Hayes asked, flipping switches with a rhythmic practice speed. "Rend the hull," she said, leaning forward. The structural integrity was at maximum. Hayes paused, looking over his shoulder at her, a smirk playing on his lips that was both arrogant and devastatingly handsome. "You were inside," he said, the simplicity of the statement carrying more weight than any grand declaration. He turned back to the monitors, his broad shoulders filling her vision. Aurora felt a strange, tightening sensation in her chest. For years, she had watched him work in the docking bays, a quiet human who kept to himself. She had thought him unremarkable. Now, seeing the way his hands moved, the same hands that had just torn through alloy, she felt a hunger stirring. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a deep, biological recognition of a protector. The ship lurched as they broke orbit, the stars stretching into long ribbons of light. Hayes finally exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate some of the tension in his frame. He stood up and walked toward her, his movements losing their frantic edge and becoming something more fluid, more sensual. He stopped inches away, his shadow falling over her. "We're clear," Hayes said, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for a crack in her composure. "Why did you come for me?" Aurora asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because I've spent 6 months watching you walk past my station and pretending I didn't want to do exactly what I'm about to do now," Hayes replied, his voice dropping an octave. He leaned down, his hands gripping the arms of her chair, pinning her in place. The scent of him, salt, heat, and something uniquely human, filled her senses. Aurora reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his collarbone. "And what is that?" she challenged, her heart hammering against her ribs. Hayes didn't hesitate, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that was as forceful as his rescue. It wasn't the delicate, restrained affection of her people. It was a claim. His tongue flicked against her lips, demanding entry, and when she gave it, the world outside the ship ceased to exist. He tasted of fire and desperation. Her hands moved to his hair, pulling him closer, needing the friction of his skin against hers to ground her in the wake of the near-death experience. He pulled back just an inch, his breath hot against her mouth. "I've wanted you since the day you arrived on the station," Hayes groaned, his thumb rubbing circles against her cheekbone. "You never spoke," Aurora countered, her eyes searching his. "I'm a mechanic, Aurora, and you're a princess," Hayes said, a touch of bitterness in his voice. "But when I saw that ship start to go down, I realized I didn't care about the protocols. I'd tear the galaxy apart to get to you." He stood abruptly, reaching down to pull her up from the chair. He led her toward the back of the small cabin, where a single bunk was tucked into the bulkhead. The space was tiny, intimate, and smelled of him. Hayes sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her between his knees, his hands sliding up her thighs, bunching the fine fabric of her dress. "Humans are supposed to be the weak ones," Aurora whispered, her hands resting on his shoulders. "We're only weak when we have nothing to fight for," Hayes said, his gaze dropping to her chest, which was heaving with exertion and arousal. He began to undo the fastenings of her robe with surprising dexterity. As the silk fell away, exposing her pale, shimmering skin to the dim light of the cabin, Hayes made a sound deep in his throat, a low, animalistic growl of approval. He pressed his face against the hollow of her throat, his teeth grazing her skin in a way that made her toes curl. "Show me," Aurora pleaded, her head falling back. "Show me how strong you really are." Hayes stood, lifting her effortlessly and pressing her back against the cool metal wall of the cabin. The contrast between the cold alloy and his burning skin was intoxicating. He entered her with a single, powerful thrust that stole the breath from her lungs. It was a takeover, a total surrender to the physical reality of him. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her fingers digging into his back, marking him as her own. The rhythm was frantic, born of the adrenaline still pumping through their veins. Hayes moved with a relentless energy, his muscles rippling under her touch. Every time he hit her, she felt the sheer mass of him, the density of human bone and fiber that allowed him to perform feats of strength no other species could replicate. He wasn't just a man, he was a force of nature. "Look at me," Hayes commanded, his voice strained. Aurora opened her eyes, finding his gaze. There was a raw, naked honesty there, a vulnerability that matched his physical power. In that moment, she understood the secret of humanity. They weren't powerful because of technology or evolution. They were powerful because of the depth of their wanting. "You're mine," he rasped, his pace quickening. "Yes," she gasped, her body coiling toward a peak she had never reached before. As they shattered together, Hayes held her so tightly she thought her ribs might crack, but she didn't care. She felt safe in the crush of his arms. They collapsed onto the bunk, their bodies slick with sweat, the silence of the vacuum outside providing a stark contrast to the storm that had just passed between them. Hours later, the ship's proximity alarm blared, pulling them from a heavy, dreamless sleep. Hayes was off the bed in a second, his instincts sharp and immediate. He threw on his trousers and moved to the cockpit, Aurora following close behind, wrapping herself in a discarded shirt of his that smelled of engine oil and him. "What is it?" she asked, looking at the radar. "Scavengers," Hayes said, his jaw tightening. "They must have seen the Kestrel go down and followed our warp trail. They think we're an easy target." 3 jagged ships appeared on the view screen, their weapons systems locking on. Aurora felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. His scout ship was unarmed, designed for speed and repair, not combat. "We can't outrun them," she said, her voice small. Hayes looked at her, and for a moment, the softness of their intimate encounter was gone, replaced by the hard, diamond-edged focus of a man who had already decided he wasn't going to die. "I'm not running," Hayes said. He sat in the pilot's chair and began rerouting power. Aurora watched the displays, her confusion growing. He was dumping the life support reserves into the thrusters and the manual docking clamps. "Hayes, what are you doing?" she asked. "Humans have a saying," Hayes said, his hands flying across the console. "If you can't beat them, break them." He pushed the throttle forward, and the Avery leaped toward the nearest scavenger ship. Instead of veering away, Hayes aimed directly for their main hangar bay. At the last second, he flipped the ship, using the underside as a shield. The impact was deafening, the sound of metal grinding on metal echoing through the cabin. "Stay here," Hayes ordered, grabbing a heavy wrench from the floor. He didn't wait for her response. He cycled the inner airlock and stepped out into the scavenger's hangar. Aurora watched through the external cameras, her heart in her throat. Hayes didn't use a gun. He moved like a whirlwind, using his superior mass and momentum to throw the smaller, spindly scavengers across the bay. He was a blur of violence, snapping limbs and crushing armor with his bare hands. When the scavenger leader stepped out, a towering beast with 4 arms and a pulse rifle, Aurora screamed a warning. But Hayes didn't flinch. He took a shot to the shoulder, the searing heat of the blast barely slowing him down. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, grabbed the leader by its primary throat, and slammed it into a fuel canister with enough force to dent the thick steel. He didn't stop until the hangar was silent. He stood amongst the wreckage of his enemies, blood dripping from his knuckles, his eyes glowing with an inner fire that seemed to burn through the screen. He turned back toward his ship, and for a moment he looked completely alien to her, a creature of pure, unadulterated willpower. He returned to the cabin, his chest heaving, his wound smoking. Aurora ran to him, her hands hovering over the injury. "You're hurt," she cried. "I've had worse," Hayes dismissed, though he winced as she touched him. He sat on the floor, leaning his head back against the bunk. Aurora knelt between his legs, using a med kit to tend to the burn. She worked in silence, her mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. He had taken on an entire crew with nothing but a hand tool and his own body. "How?" she asked softly, wrapping the bandage around his shoulder. Hayes looked at her, his expression softening. "Adrenaline," he said. "Our bodies are built to survive things that should kill us. When we're pushed, our brains unlock the limiters on our muscles. It's a fail-safe." "It's terrifying," Aurora whispered. "Does it scare you?" Hayes asked, his good arm reaching out to pull her closer. Aurora looked into his eyes and saw the man who had held her with such tenderness only an hour before. The fear was there, yes, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of awe. "No," she said, leaning in to kiss his forehead. "It makes me feel like the luckiest woman in the galaxy." They spent the next few days drifting toward the nearest Zalosian outpost. With the engines damaged from the ramming maneuver, they had nothing but time. The cabin became a sanctuary, a world where the hierarchies of the galaxy didn't apply. Hayes taught her about Earth, about the mountains and the oceans, and the way the air smelled after a storm. In return, she told him of the glass cities of Zalosia and the songs of her people. Their physical connection deepened with every passing hour. Without the rush of combat, their lovemaking became slower, more exploratory. Hayes was a patient teacher, showing her the myriad ways the human body could give and receive pleasure. He was attentive to her every sigh, her every tremor, his strength always channeled into a controlled, rhythmic devotion. "I don't want to go back," Aurora admitted one night, her head resting on his chest. "You have to," Hayes said, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. "Your people will be looking for you. You're a princess, remember." "I don't feel like one here," she said, looking up at him. "Here I'm just yours." Hayes went still, his gaze intensifying. He rolled over, pinning her beneath him, his weight a comforting pressure. "You are mine," he affirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't change who you are out there. I'm just a guy who fixes things." "You fixed me," Aurora said, her hands framing his face. "You showed me that everything I was taught about power was wrong. Power isn't in a title or a fleet. It's in the heart of a man who refuses to let go." As the Zylosian rescue fleet finally appeared on the long-range sensors, a sense of melancholy settled over them. Hayes, dressed in his scorched flight suit, looking every bit the weary soldier. Aurora put on her silk robes, but they felt like a cage now. The transfer was formal and cold. Xylosian officers in gleaming armor boarded the Avery, their eyes full of disdain for the small, battered human vessel. They looked at Hayes as if he were a piece of equipment that had performed a mildly interesting task. "We thank you for your service to the Crown, human," the lead officer said, his voice echoing in the small cabin. "A reward will be transferred to your account." Hayes stood at attention, his face a mask of professional indifference. But Aurora saw the way his jaw was clenched, the way his hands were balled into fists at his sides. "Wait," Aurora commanded, stepping forward. The officers paused, surprised by the steel in her voice. "This man did not just service the Crown," she said, her eyes flashing. "He saved my life by doing what none of you could. He tore through a hull with his bare hands. He fought off a scavenger crew alone. He is not a servant. He is a hero." She turned to Hayes, ignoring the gasps of her attendants. She walked to him and took his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "I will not leave without him," she declared. "Princess, that is highly irregular," the officer stammered. "Then the galaxy is about to become a very irregular place," Aurora replied. She looked at Hayes, a question in her eyes. He didn't say anything, but the way he squeezed her hand told her everything she needed to know. He was ready for whatever came next. The journey back to the capital was a blur of political maneuvering and scandal. The news of the princess and her human protector spread like wildfire. On Xylosia, Aurora stood before the High Council, Hayes at her side. The elders looked down at him with skepticism, their long, thin fingers tapping on the crystalline tables. "You claim this human possesses strength beyond our understanding," the High Priestess said, her voice like rustling silk. "Prove it." She gestured to a massive, ancient stone pillar in the center of the chamber, a relic of their founding days that weighed several tons. "If he can move the stone of fate, we will acknowledge his place at your side," she challenged. Aurora felt a pang of worry. It was a trap. No biological entity could move that stone without gravity-assist rigs. She looked at Hayes, ready to protest, but he was already stepping forward. He walked to the stone, circling it once. He looked back at Aurora and winked. It was a small, human gesture that filled her with a sudden, irrational confidence. Hayes planted his feet, his boots cracking the polished floor. He reached down, find a grip in the weathered grooves of the stone. His muscles began to swell, his neck veins standing out like cords of iron. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a growl of pure, unbridled effort. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sound of stone grinding against stone filled the silent chamber. The pillar groaned, then tilted. With a final, explosive heave, Hayes shoved the stone a full 3 feet across the floor. He stood up, gasping for air, his shirt torn across his back from the sheer expansion of his muscles. He wiped sweat from his brow and looked up at the council, his gaze level and unafraid. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. The High Priestess sat back, her eyes wide. For the first time in 1,000 years, the council was speechless. Aurora walked to Hayes, her heart bursting with pride. She didn't care about the laws or the traditions. She saw the truth of her species' future in the man standing before her. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic of the palace changed. Hayes wasn't just a guest, he became a symbol. The Xylosians, once so certain of their superiority, found themselves fascinated by this human who defied their logic. And Hayes, in his typical fashion, ignored the fame and focused on Aurora. They spent their evenings in the royal gardens, under the light of the distant stars. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, and the sound of falling water provided a soothing backdrop to their conversations. "You didn't have to do that, you know," Aurora said, leaning against his shoulder. "Moving the stone." "I wanted them to know," Hayes said, his arm draped around her waist. "I wanted them to know that if they ever try to take you away from me, there isn't a wall in this palace I can't walk through." He turned her into his arms, his touch as electric as the first time they had met. He kissed her deeply, a slow, lingering promise of the night to come. "I think they got the message," Aurora whispered against his lips. As the suns of Zylosia set, casting long, golden shadows across the balcony, Aurora looked out at the horizon. She knew there would be challenges ahead. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and humanity was still a mystery to most. But as she felt the steady, powerful beat of Hayes's heart against her back, she knew they were ready. Humans weren't the strongest because of their machines or their weapons. They were the strongest because when they loved with a ferocity that could tear apart the very fabric of the universe. And as Hayes picked her up to carry her into the sleeping chambers, Aurora knew she would never look at a human, or the stars, the same way again. The weight of him on her, the heat of his breath, and the relentless, protective power of his embrace were all the proof she needed. Humanity had arrived, and they weren't just here to survive. They were here to change everything, one broken door at a time. Hayes lowered her onto the bed, his eyes dark with a hunger that never seemed to fade. He began to strip away her royal finery, his movements deliberate and possessive. Every inch of skin he revealed he claimed with a kiss or a graze of his teeth. Aurora arched beneath him, her hands wandering over the vast landscape of his chest, marveling at the strength that was now entirely devoted to her pleasure. "You're thinking too much," Hayes murmured, his hands sliding under her hips. "I'm thinking about how much I love you," she replied, her voice breaking. "Then stop thinking and feel it," he said, and proceeded to show her exactly what he meant. The night stretched on, a symphony of gasps and soft cries that echoed through the hallowed halls of the palace. Outside, the guards stood watch, but they all knew that the real power on Zylosia wasn't in the throne room or the armory. It was in the private chambers of the princess, where a single human man was proving, moment by moment, that the limits of the possible were meant to be shattered. When morning finally broke, Hayes was still awake, watching her sleep. He traced the curve of her ear with a gentle finger, a small smile on his face. He had come to this sector of space looking for work, for a way to make a living among the stars. He had found something much more valuable. He had found a reason to be the monster the galaxy feared and the hero she deserved. Aurora stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him and smiled, reaching out to pull him back down to her. "Stay," she whispered. "Always," Hayes promised, and for a human, that was the most powerful word of all. "Would you like me to write a follow-up scene, focusing on the first official diplomatic mission, where Hayes has to use his unique human skills to protect Aurora in a high-stakes galactic summit?"